The scorching July sun beat down on Newton, Kansas, as Zara Sinclair screamed for help. The thick black smoke from the burning barn billowing into the clear blue sky of 1871. The railroad town, newly established as a cattle shipping point, hadn't expected such violence on what had begun as an ordinary day, but nothing would be ordinary again after what was about to unfold. Heath Irving wiped sweat from his brow, adjusting his worn leather hat as he guided his chestnut mare through the dusty Main Street. At 27, he'd spent nearly 10 years driving cattle across the plains, his skin weathered from the sun and his hands calloused from hard work. The Santa Fe Railroad's arrival had transformed Sleepy Newton into a bustling hub for Texas cattlemen, bringing with it both prosperity and peril. Heath dismounted outside the general store, hitching his horse to the post. The journey had been long, and all he wanted was supplies and perhaps a whiskey before finding a place to rest. But the distant cries changed everything. Fire! Help! Someone's trapped in the Buchanan barn. A young boy ran down the street, pointing frantically toward the edge of town. Heath's head snapped up, eyes narrowing at the column of smoke rising in the distance. Without hesitation, he untied his horse and swung himself back into the saddle. The mare responded instantly to his urgency, hooves pounding against the packed earth as they galloped toward the blaze. The barn came into view around a bend in the road, flames already consuming the wooden structure, licking hungrily at the dry timber. The heat hit him like a wall as he approached, dismounting and rushing toward the small crowd that had gathered at a safe distance. "Is anyone inside?" Heath demanded, grabbing the arm of a man who seemed frozen in shock. "Zara Sinclair," the man stammered. "Jenkins and his boys locked her in there and set it alight. Said she cheated them in a land deal, but that ain't true. They're just mad her father left her the property instead of selling to them." Heath didn't wait to hear more. Tying his bandana over his nose and mouth, he sprinted toward the burning structure. The heat was oppressive, the smoke thick enough to choke on even before he reached the barn doors. They were barred from the outside, a deliberate act of cruelty that made his blood boil. "Is anyone in there?" he shouted, pounding on the wood. A weak cough answered him. "Help, please!" The woman's voice was barely audible over the roar of the flames. Heath grabbed the heavy wooden beam that had been wedged across the doors. It was secured tightly, and for a moment, panic seized him. This wasn't something he could simply lift away. Drawing his revolver, he fired at the hinges holding the beam in place, splintering the wood. With a grunt of effort, he heaved the beam aside and threw his weight against the doors. They gave way with a crack, releasing a billowing cloud of black smoke that momentarily blinded him. Pulling his bandana higher, Heath dropped to his knees where the air was clearest and crawled into the inferno. "Where are you?" he called, squinting through the smoke. "Here." The response came from his left, followed by violent coughing. Heath moved toward the sound, finding a woman tied to one of the support beams. Her dress was torn and smudged with soot, her dark hair falling in disarray around her shoulders, but her eyes, a striking green even through the smoke, flashed with defiance rather than defeat. "Hold on," Heath said, pulling his knife from his boot to saw through the ropes binding her wrists. The flames were creeping closer, and the roof beams had begun to groan ominously overhead. As the last rope fell away, Zara collapsed against him, her legs weak from being bound. Without hesitation, Heath scooped her into his arms and turned toward the door. The path they'd entered through was now blocked by fallen, burning debris. "There's a back door," Zara managed between coughs, pointing weakly toward the rear of the barn. Heath nodded, holding her tightly against his chest as he navigated through the burning maze. The heat was unbearable now, searing his lungs with each breath. A beam crashed down just behind them, showering them with burning splinters. Heath felt them singe the back of his neck, but he pressed on. The back door was mercifully unbarred. With one powerful kick, Heath forced it open and stumbled into the blessed coolness of the outside air. He didn't stop running until they were well clear of the structure, finally setting Zara down gently on a patch of grass. She drew in ragged breaths, coughing violently as her lungs fought to expel the smoke. Heath knelt beside her, his own breathing labored but his focus entirely on her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough from the smoke. Zara shook her head, then winced, raising a hand to a nasty bruise forming on her temple. "They hit me when I fought back." Her voice was surprisingly steady despite everything. "Thank you. You saved my life." Before Heath could respond, the barn's roof collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks skyward. People were running toward them now, townsfolk who'd been too afraid to approach the burning building, but found their courage now that the immediate danger had passed. "Miss Sinclair. Are you all right?" An older woman rushed forward, draping a blanket around Zara's shoulders. "I will be, Mrs. Peterson," Zara answered, her eyes never leaving Heath's face. "Thanks to this man." Heath stood awkwardly, suddenly aware of his soot-covered appearance and the curious stares of the gathering crowd. "Anyone would have done the same," he said. Zara's lips curved into a small, pained smile. "But they didn't. You did." A stocky man pushed his way through the crowd, the silver star on his vest identifying him as the town marshal. "What in tarnation happened here?" he demanded, looking from Zara to the smoldering remains of the barn. "Jenkins and his boys," Zara said, her voice hardening. "They jumped me when I was checking the property line. Said they were teaching me a lesson about women trying to do men's business." The marshal's face darkened. "You're sure it was them?" "I saw their faces plain as day, Marshal Davis. They didn't even bother to hide them. Guess they thought there wouldn't be anyone to identify them afterward." Her voice trembled slightly, the reality of how close she'd come to death finally sinking in. "I'll round up a posse," Marshal Davis said grimly. "They can't have gotten far." He turned to Heath, extending his hand. "Don't believe we've met, stranger, but you've done this town a service today." "Heath Irving," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "Just passing through." "Well, Mr. Irving, you picked a fortunate time to pass through, at least for Miss Sinclair." The marshal tipped his hat to Zara. "Rest up, madam. I'll come by later for a full statement." As the crowd dispersed, following the marshal to form a posse or returning to their interrupted daily activities, Zara attempted to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, and Heath caught her before she could fall. "Whoa there," he said gently. "You've been through an ordeal. Let's get you somewhere you can rest." "My house is just over the ridge," Zara said, pointing toward a modest homestead visible in the distance. "I can manage." Heath raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "With all due respect, Miss Sinclair, you can barely stand. Let me help you." For a moment, it seemed she would argue, a flash of stubborn pride crossing her features, but then she nodded, accepting his support. "I suppose you've earned the right to be insistent, Mr. Irving." Heath whistled for his mare, who trotted over obediently. With careful hands, he helped Zara into the saddle before mounting behind her. She was light in his arms, but he could feel the strength in her frame. This was no delicate flower, despite her current weakness. They rode in silence, Zara occasionally directing him with a soft word or gesture. As they approached the homestead, Heath could see it was well maintained, with a small but thriving vegetable garden to one side and a modest corral where 2 horses grazed peacefully. "It's not much," Zara said, seemingly reading his thoughts, "but it's mine, all 40 acres of it." "It's impressive," Heath replied honestly, "especially for someone managing it alone. Zara gave him a look that suggested she'd heard such comments before. Women are capable of more than most men give them credit for, Mr. Irving. I didn't mean, Heath began, but she waved away his protest. I know, and you did just save my life, so I'll spare you the lecture. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, softening her features. Heath helped her down from the horse and supported her to the front door. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, a main room with a kitchen area, a wooden table with chairs, and a small sitting area with a worn armchair. He could see 2 doors leading off to what he presumed were bedrooms. "Please, sit," Zara said, gesturing to a chair as she steadied herself against the table. "I should offer you something after what you've done, but I'm afraid I'm not much of a hostess at the moment." "Don't worry about hospitality," Heath said, guiding her to the armchair instead of taking a seat himself. "You need to rest." Zara didn't argue, sinking into the chair with a sigh. In the better light of the house, Heath could see that her injuries were more extensive than he'd first realized. Besides the bruise on her temple, there were rope burns on her wrists and a cut on her lower lip where she'd likely been struck. "Is there a doctor in town?" he asked, frowning at the bruise which was darkening by the minute. "Dr. Wilson," Zara confirmed, "but there's no need. I've had worse falls from a horse. Some clean water and rest will do fine." Heath hesitated, then nodded. "Where do you keep your medical supplies?" "Cabinet above the wash basin," she directed, pointing to the kitchen area. Heath found a clean cloth and bowl, filled it with water from a pitcher, and returned to her side. With gentle hands that belied his rugged appearance, he cleaned the soot and blood from her face. Zara watched him with curious eyes, wincing occasionally when he touched a tender spot. "You've done this before," she observed. Heath shrugged. 10 years on cattle drives teaches a man basic doctoring. Cowhands aren't exactly careful with themselves. And what brings a cowhand to Newton? The cattle season's just beginning. "I'm between outfits," Heath admitted. "Thought I might find work with the railroad for a spell. The trail drives are getting more dangerous each year with the settlers moving in, establishing their boundaries." Zara nodded, understanding. "The world's changing, not always for the better." "Says the woman who just got locked in a burning barn for owning property," Heath remarked dryly. To his surprise, Zara laughed, a short, pained sound but genuine. "Point taken." She sobered quickly. "Jenkins and his men won't be happy when they learn I survived. They want this land badly. It controls access to the creek that feeds half the valley. The marshal will catch them," Heath said with more confidence than he felt. In his experience, the law was often stretched thin in frontier towns. "Maybe," Zara said, clearly sharing his doubts. "But even if he does, they have friends. This won't end today." Heath finished cleaning her wounds in silence, his mind turning over the situation. He had planned to be in Newton only long enough to resupply before moving on, but something about Zara Sinclair's courage in the face of such blatant cruelty touched him. Besides, he couldn't in good conscience leave a woman alone after such an attack, regardless of how capable she clearly was. "I could stay," he found himself saying, "just until Marshal Davis catches these men, for safety's sake." Zara's green eyes widened slightly in surprise, then narrowed in assessment. "Mr. Irving, while I appreciate the offer, I've been taking care of myself for some time now." "I don't doubt it," Heath replied, "but even the most capable person needs rest after what you've been through. And having someone around might discourage Jenkins and his friends from trying again too quickly." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to divine his true intentions. Finally, she nodded. "The bunkhouse out back has a spare cot. It's not much, but it's shelter." "That's all I need," Heath said, relieved she'd accepted his offer without too much argument. "I'll see to my horse and then check the property before dark." As he stood to leave, Zara caught his wrist, her touch light but firm. "Mr. Irving Heath, thank you. Not just for the rescue, but for this. It's been a while since anyone offered help without wanting something in return." The sincerity in her voice made his chest tighten strangely. "It's nothing, Miss Sinclair." "Zara," she corrected. "After carrying me out of a burning building, I think you've earned first-name privileges." Heath smiled, tipping his hat. "Zara, then. Rest. I'll be close if you need anything." Outside, Heath took his time settling his mare in the small stable, using the familiar tasks to organize his thoughts. He hadn't planned on playing hero or bodyguard, but something about Zara's situation stirred his sense of justice. And if he was being honest with himself, there was something about Zara herself that intrigued him: her fierce independence, her dignity, even in distress. After ensuring his horse was comfortable, Heath walked the perimeter of the property, noting its strengths and vulnerabilities. The house was well positioned with clear sightlines in most directions, but the cluster of cottonwood trees to the north could provide cover for someone approaching with ill intent. He made a mental note to check that area frequently if he took up watch during the night. As the sun began to set, painting the Kansas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Heath returned to the house. He knocked lightly, not wanting to startle Zara or wake her if she'd fallen asleep. "Come in," her voice called, stronger now than it had been earlier. Inside, Heath found Zara had moved to the table where she sat with a cup of coffee. She'd changed into clean clothes, a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, and washed the soot from her hair, which now fell in dark waves around her shoulders. The bruise on her temple stood out starkly against her pale skin, but her eyes were clear and alert. "The property looks sound," Heath reported, removing his hat as he entered. "Though those trees to the north provide a bit too much cover for my liking." "I've thought the same," Zara agreed, gesturing for him to join her at the table. "Coffee, it's fresh." Heath nodded gratefully, taking the seat across from her. "Thank you." She poured him a cup from the pot on the table, her movements careful but no longer shaky. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said, sliding the cup toward him. "Jenkins must have been planning this for some time. He's been making offers on the land since my father died last winter, but lately he's been more insistent." "Has he threatened you before?" Heath asked, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Zara's expression hardened. "Not directly, but his foreman, Decker, made some comments last month about how dangerous it is for a woman alone. Said it would be a shame if something happened and no one was around to help." Heath's jaw tightened. "That's not subtle." "No, it's not, but I didn't think they'd go this far." She shook her head, a flash of vulnerability crossing her face before she masked it. "I was naive." "You were trusting that people would obey the law," Heath corrected gently. "That's not naive, it's civilized." Zara gave a short, humorless laugh. "Civilization's a thin veneer out here, Mr. Irving. I should have remembered that." Before Heath could respond, a knock at the door made them both tense. Heath's hand moved instinctively to his revolver as he stood. "Who is it?" Zara called, her voice steady despite the sudden fear in her eyes. "Marshall Davis, Miss Sinclair. Got news about Jenkins." Heath relaxed slightly but kept his hand near his weapon as Zara moved to open the door. The marshal stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking grim. "Evening, Marshal," Zara said, stepping back to let him enter. "This is Heath Irving. He's staying in the bunkhouse for a few days." The marshal nodded to Heath before turning his attention back to Zara. "We tracked Jenkins and his men to the river crossing, but they'd already moved on. Got about 10 men searching, but it'll be hard to find them in the dark." "So they're still out there," Zara said flatly. "For now," the marshal confirmed. "But they know we're looking, and they know you survived to identify them. That changes things. They might decide to cut their losses and run. Or they might decide to finish what they started, Heath said quietly. Marshall Davis glanced at him, then back to Zara. That's a possibility, yes, which is why I'm glad you've got someone staying here, Miss Sinclair. I can spare a deputy to ride by every few hours, but with the cattle season picking up, we're stretched thin. We'll manage, Zara assured him, though Heath could see the tension in her shoulders. The marshal nodded. I've sent telegrams to the surrounding towns. If Jenkins shows his face anywhere within 50 miles, we'll hear about it. After the marshal left, promising to return in the morning with any news, a heavy silence fell over the house. Zara moved to the window, staring out into the gathering darkness. You should lock up tight tonight, Heath advised. I'll keep watch from the bunkhouse. It has a good view of the approach to the main house. Zara turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. You're taking quite a risk for a stranger, Mr. Irving. Heath, he reminded her with a slight smile. And I've never been one to walk away from trouble, especially when it's not of the other person's making. Something in her posture softened. Well, I won't pretend I'm not grateful for the company tonight. She hesitated, then added, I was planning to make a simple stew for dinner. There's plenty if you'd like to join me. Heath recognized the offer for what it was, not just a meal, but a small gesture of trust. I'd be honored, he replied. Though I should warn you, trail cooks haven't exactly spoiled me. My standards are embarrassingly low. That earned him a genuine smile, transforming Zara's face and making Heath momentarily forget the danger that had brought them together. Then I'll try not to disappoint, she said, moving toward the kitchen area. Though I should warn you in return, my father always said I was a better rancher than a cook. My mother always said food tastes better with good company, Heath countered, following to help. Let me know what I can do. They worked together comfortably, Zara preparing the vegetables while Heath tended the fire in the small stove. It struck him as oddly domestic, given the circumstances this morning. He'd been a drifter with no particular destination, and now he was sharing a kitchen with a woman he'd pulled from a burning building. How did you come to own this place? Heath asked as they worked, genuinely curious about the woman who had faced down death with such dignity. Zara's hand stilled momentarily before resuming their task. My father built it. He came out here after the war. He was a Union officer who'd had enough of fighting. Wanted to make something new. Pride colored her voice as she continued. He taught me everything about ranching, right alongside my brother Aaron. Said there was no reason a girl shouldn't learn the same as a boy. Your brother doesn't help with the place. Heath asked carefully, noting the past tense she'd used when speaking of her father. A shadow crossed Zara's face. Aaron died 2 years ago. Fever took him quick. Then Pa last winter, so it's just been me since then. She looked up, meeting his gaze with a defiant lift of her chin. And I've managed just fine. I don't doubt it, Heath said sincerely. It takes grit to run a place alone, man or woman. What about you? Zara asked, clearly wanting to shift the conversation away from her losses. How does a man with your instincts end up driving cattle? Heath smiled at her diplomatic phrasing. My instincts, as you call them, developed on the trail. I left home at 17. My father was a banker in St. Louis who had my future all mapped out. I had other ideas. He shrugged, stoking the fire. Found work with a cattle outfit heading to Sedalia. Discovered I had a knack for the life. And your family, letters at Christmas, Heath said simply. My mother understands even if she worries. My father, less so. He still thinks I'll come to my senses and join the family business eventually. Will you? Zara asked, her green eyes studying him with interest. Heath considered the question seriously. Once I'd have said never. Now I'm not sure. The open range is changing. Barbed wire, homesteaders, railroads pushing further west. The days of the long drives might be numbered. "So you're at a crossroads," Zara observed, adding the vegetables to the pot bubbling on the stove. "I suppose I am," Heath admitted, though I hadn't thought of it quite that way until now. They continued talking as the stew simmered, sharing stories of their lives that gradually revealed more about each other than either had initially intended. Heath told her about the best and worst of his trail experiences, the magnificent thunderstorms that lit up the entire prairie, the camaraderie around campfires, but also the dangers of river crossings gone wrong and the loneliness that sometimes settled in despite the constant company. Zara, in turn, spoke of her determination to make the ranch succeed despite the obstacles, of the small victories like the first season she'd managed entirely on her own, and the neighbors who'd eventually come to respect her capabilities despite their initial skepticism. By the time they sat down to eat, Heath felt as though he'd known Zara much longer than a mere few hours. The stew was simple but hearty, and true to his word, Heath enjoyed it immensely, though whether that was due to the food itself or the company, he couldn't quite say. As they finished their meal, Zara suddenly looked up at him with an expression of realization. "I've just noticed you never once asked why Jenkins wants this land so badly. Most men would have wanted to know the business details right away." Heath set down his spoon. "I figured you'd tell me if it was important to know. The why doesn't change that they were wrong." Zara studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if he'd passed some test. "The creek that runs through the north end of my property feeds into the Republican River. Jenkins has been buying up land all along that watershed. I think he's planning to dam it up and control water access for the whole valley, which would give him power over every rancher and farmer in the area," Heath concluded, understanding dawning. "No wonder he's desperate enough to resort to murder." "Exactly. My father suspected the same, which is why he refused to sell to Jenkins even when he offered twice what the land was worth." Zara's expression hardened. "And I won't betray that principle, even if it means facing men like Jenkins." "A principle that nearly got you killed today," Heath pointed out gently. "Some things are worth risking everything for," Zara replied, her voice quiet but firm. "This land isn't just property to me. It's my father's legacy, my brother's memory. It's my home and my future. If I let men like Jenkins take it through intimidation, what kind of future would that be?" Her words resonated with Heath in unexpected ways. In his years of drifting, he'd never found something he valued enough to take such a stand. The realization left him feeling strangely hollow. "You should get some rest," he said finally, rising to clear their plates. "It's been a long day, and tomorrow might bring its own challenges." Zara didn't argue, the events of the day clearly catching up with her. Together they cleaned up from the meal, moving around each other with an ease that belied their short acquaintance. When everything was in order, Heath prepared to head out to the bunkhouse. "I'll check the property once more before turning in," he assured her. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it unless you're certain who's on the other side." Zara nodded, following him to the door. As he stepped onto the porch, she caught his arm gently. "Heath, thank you, not just for today but for staying. It means more than I can say." In the soft glow of the lamplight spilling from the doorway, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her green eyes earnest, Zara looked both vulnerable and strong, a combination that stirred something protective in Heath's chest. "Try to get some sleep," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I'll be close by." She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded and closed the door. Heath waited until he heard the lock slide into place before turning toward the bunkhouse, his mind full of the remarkable woman he'd met under the most dire circumstances, and the strange twist of fate that had brought him to Newton, Kansas, just when Zara Sinclair needed someone the most. The night passed without incident, though Heath slept lightly, waking at every unusual sound. Dawn found him on the small porch of the bunkhouse, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in delicate pinks and golds. The beauty of it struck him anew, as it often did during his years on the trail, a reminder of why he'd chosen this life of freedom under endless skies, rather than the confined existence his father had planned for him. Movement from the main house caught his attention. Zara emerged, dressed in practical trousers and a man's shirt, her hair braided and pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She spotted him and raised a hand in greeting before heading toward the small corral where her horses grazed. Heath crossed the yard to join her. "Morning," he called as he approached. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Zara admitted with a wry smile, "but alive, which is more than Jenkins intended. The animals need tending, regardless of what happened yesterday." "Let me help," Heath offered, falling into step beside her. "I'm guessing you've got more than just horses to look after." "A few cattle, some chickens, a milk cow," Zara confirmed. "Nothing grand, but it's enough to keep me busy and fed." They worked together through the morning chores, establishing a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Heath found himself impressed by Zara's efficiency and knowledge. She clearly knew her business, handling the animals with confident ease despite her injuries from the previous day. As they finished feeding the chickens, Marshal Davis rode up the lane toward the house, another man at his side. Zara shaded her eyes against the morning sun, watching their approach. "That's Deputy Collins with him," she said, recognizing the second rider. "I wonder if they've found Jenkins." They met the lawman at the front of the house. The marshal dismounted stiffly, nodding to them both. "Miss Sinclair, Mr. Irving," he greeted. "Thought you'd want to know we found Jenkins and his men." Zara tensed beside Heath. "Where?" "Holed up at the old Miller place about 10 miles south," the marshal replied. "Collins here spotted smoke from their campfire early this morning." "Have you arrested them?" Heath asked, noting the marshal's grim expression. Marshal Davis exchanged a look with his deputy. "Not yet. There's 5 of them, well armed, and they've made it clear they won't come quietly. I'm gathering more men before we move in." "They know we're watching them," Deputy Collins added. "They're not going anywhere for now." Zara crossed her arms, her face troubled. "What if they slip away before you can gather enough men?" "That's partly why I'm here," the marshal said. "We've got 2 men keeping an eye on them, but I wanted to warn you to stay especially alert. If they do manage to slip past us, they might head here to finish what they started, or to eliminate the witness who could send them to prison." Heath felt Zara stiffen beside him, though her expression remained resolute. "We understand, Marshal. Thank you for the warning." After the lawman departed, promising to return with news once they dealt with Jenkins, Zara walked to the edge of the porch and stared out across her land, her posture tense. "They'll catch them," Heath said, moving to stand beside her. "Perhaps," Zara replied, unconvinced. "But Jenkins has friends in high places. Even if they do arrest him, I'm not sure justice will be served." Heath couldn't argue with her assessment. He'd seen enough frontier justice to know that money and influence often counted for more than law and right. "What will you do?" he asked. "If Jenkins escapes punishment," Zara turned to face him, determination etched in every line of her face. "Stand my ground. Keep fighting." "What else can I do?" "You could sell," Heath suggested, though he knew even as he said it that she wouldn't consider it. "Start fresh somewhere else, somewhere safer." As expected, Zara shook her head firmly. "This is my home. If I run from Jenkins, I'll be running for the rest of my life. Besides," she added, her gaze sweeping across the rolling grassland that surrounded them, "I love this place. Every acre, Every tree, every sunrise. I can't imagine being anywhere else." Her passion was evident in her voice, in the way her eyes lit up as she looked at her land. Heath found himself envying her certainty, her connection to this specific piece of earth. In his years of wandering, he'd seen countless beautiful places, but had never felt such a profound attachment to any of them. "Then we make sure you can stay," Heath said simply, "starting with reinforcing the house, just in case Jenkins does come calling." They spent the day making the property as secure as possible, boarding up the most vulnerable windows, creating makeshift barriers that could provide cover in case of attack, and establishing clear fields of fire from defensive positions. Heath taught Zara how to use the shotgun she kept for hunting but had never fired in anger, showing her the most effective ways to handle the weapon in different scenarios. As evening approached, they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The day's labor had left them tired, but with the satisfaction of having done everything possible to prepare. "You're good at this," Zara observed, passing Heath a cup of coffee. "Planning defenses, thinking ahead about potential attacks, not typical cowboy skills." Heath accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "I served briefly with the army after the war before I took up the cattle drives. Learned a thing or two about defensive positions." "You fought in the war?" Zara asked, surprised. "You seem too young." "I was," Heath admitted. "Lied about my age and enlisted in '64, just turned 16. My father was furious when he found out, but by then I was already in uniform." He stared into his coffee, the memories still sharp despite the years that had passed. "Saw the tail end of the fighting, then stayed on for a while during the early Reconstruction." "My father and brother both served," Zara said quietly. "Pa never talked much about it, but it changed him. Aaron, too, though he was just a boy when he went in near the end." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts as the sky darkened and stars began to appear one by one. The peace of the moment felt precious, especially given the danger that still lurked. "Tell me about your dreams," Heath said suddenly. "What do you want for this place, beyond just keeping it?" Zara seemed surprised by the question, but after a moment's consideration, she began to speak, her voice growing animated as she described her vision. She wanted to expand the cattle operation, focusing on breeding stock rather than beef cattle. She had plans for improving the water access, for cultivating certain sections of the property, for eventually building a larger house to replace the modest one her father had constructed. "Ambitious," Heath commented when she finally paused for breath. "Too ambitious?" Zara asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. Heath shook his head. "Not at all, just impressive. You've thought it all through carefully." "I've had time," Zara said with a small shrug. "Winter evenings alone give you plenty of opportunity to plan." She turned the question back on him. "What about you? What dreams does a wandering cowboy harbor?" It was Heath's turn to be caught off guard. He'd spent so long living day to day, season to season, that the concept of long-term dreams felt almost foreign. "I'm not sure I know anymore," he admitted. "Once, I dreamed of seeing every corner of the frontier before it disappeared. Maybe owning a small spread someday, something manageable for one man." "And now," Zara prompted gently. Heath found himself looking at her, really looking at her in the fading light, and felt a strange tightness in his chest. In just a day, this remarkable woman had made him question the rootless existence he'd accepted as his fate. "Now, I'm not so sure the wandering is enough anymore," he said finally, "but I haven't found what would make me want to stop." Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding perhaps, or the recognition of a shared loneliness neither had fully acknowledged before. Zara's gaze held his, unwavering, and Heath found himself leaning slightly toward her, drawn by some force he couldn't name. The distant sound of hoofbeats broke the spell. Both turned toward the sound, instantly alert. Heath stood, hand moving to his revolver, while Zara reached for the shotgun leaning against the wall beside her. "Single rider," Heath observed, straining to see through the gathering darkness. "Coming fast." They waited tensely as the rider approached, becoming visible in the last light of dusk. It was Deputy Collins, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Miss Sinclair," he called as he drew near. "Jenkins and his men have slipped past our watchers. Marshal Davis sent me to warn you they could be headed this way." Heath and Zara exchanged grim looks. Their preparations were about to be put to the test. "How long ago?" Heath demanded as the deputy dismounted. "About an hour," Collins replied, leading his exhausted horse to the hitching post. "Marshall's gathering every man he can find and heading this way, but it'll take time." "We'll be ready," Zara said, her voice steady despite the fear Heath could see in her eyes. "Deputy, your horse needs rest. There's water in the trough and grain in the stable." Collins nodded gratefully. "I'll see to him quickly, then help you prepare." They moved with practiced efficiency, implementing the defensive plan they'd developed earlier. Heath positioned Collins at the rear of the house with a clear view of the approach from the south, while he took the north side, covering the wooded area that provided the most cover for anyone approaching with ill intent. Zara remained inside, moving from window to window with her shotgun, ready to provide covering fire if needed. The hours crawled by in tense silence. Midnight came and went with no sign of Jenkins or his men, but none of them relaxed their vigilance. Heath knew from experience that attacks often came in the darkest hours before dawn, when exhaustion dulled reflexes and drooping eyelids betrayed even the most determined sentinel. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Heath heard a soft, unnatural rustling from the direction of the cottonwood grove. He tensed, eyes straining through the darkness. The moon was nearly full, providing just enough light to make out shadows moving among the trees. "They're here," he whispered, knowing Zara couldn't hear him from her position but needing to verbalize the confirmation for himself. Carefully, he raised his rifle, focusing on the area where he'd spotted movement. The first shot came without warning, a muzzle flash from the trees followed by the crack of a rifle. The bullet splintered the wood of the porch post just inches from Heath's head. He ducked instinctively, then returned fire, aiming for the spot where he'd seen the flash. "Collins," he shouted. "North side." The deputy responded immediately, moving to a position where he could cover the trees while still watching the southern approach. Inside the house, Heath could hear Zara moving, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet as she positioned herself at a window. More shots rang out from the trees, at least 3 different weapons by Heath's count. They were trying to pin him down while others presumably circled around to approach from another direction. A shotgun blast from inside the house confirmed his suspicion. Zara had spotted someone trying to reach the back door. Her shot was followed by a cry of pain and cursing. "Got one," she called, her voice tight but controlled. The exchange of gunfire continued, neither side gaining a clear advantage. Heath and Collins were outnumbered, but they had the benefit of prepared positions and clear fields of fire. Jenkins and his men had the cover of darkness and the trees, but were forced to expose themselves to advance. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Heath heard the pounding of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town. The shooters in the trees heard it, too. Their fire became more desperate, more frequent, as they realized their time was running out. "Marshall's coming," Collins shouted, the relief evident in his voice. One of the attackers broke cover, making a desperate run toward the house. Heath tracked him with his rifle, but before he could fire, Zara's shotgun roared again. The man stumbled, clutching his leg, but kept coming. Heath's shot finished what Zara had started, dropping the attacker to the ground where he lay still. The remaining gunmen, seeing their companion fall and hearing the approaching posse, began to withdraw, firing as they retreated to cover their escape. Heath kept up steady return fire, forcing them to move quickly and carelessly. By the time Marshal Davis and his men thundered into the yard, the shooting had stopped. The attackers had fled into the woods, leaving behind one dead man, the one Heath and Zara had shot, and a blood trail that suggested at least one other was wounded. "Everyone all right?" the marshal called as he dismounted, rifle in hand. "We're fine," Heath answered, finally allowing himself to lower his weapon. "They tried to rush the house but couldn't get past our defenses." The marshal organized his men quickly, sending most in pursuit of the fleeing attackers while he and 2 others remained at the homestead. As the immediate danger passed, Heath hurried to check on Zara, finding her pale but composed, her shotgun still gripped firmly in her hands. "You're not hurt?" he asked, scanning her for any signs of injury. Zara shook her head. "They never got close enough." Her eyes met his, relief evident in their green depths. Just some splinters from near misses," Heath assured her, showing her a small cut on his hand where a wood fragment had caught him. "Nothing serious." They stepped outside together as the marshal examined the body of the fallen attacker. "It's Decker, Jenkins's foreman," he confirmed grimly. "No sign of Jenkins himself among the ones we're chasing, but we'll get him." The eastern sky was brightening steadily now, the new day washing away the shadows that had sheltered their attackers. Heath stood beside Zara on the porch, watching as the marshal's men secured the scene and prepared to transport Decker's body back to town. "It's not over," Zara said quietly. "Even if they catch Jenkins, he has too many connections. He'll find a way to come after me again." Heath considered her words carefully before responding. "Maybe, but he's a murderer now, or at least an accessory to attempted murder. That changes things, even for a man with connections." Zara didn't look convinced. "I hope you're right." As the day progressed, reports came in from the pursuing posse. They'd captured 2 more of Jenkins's men, both wounded, but Jenkins himself and 1 other had managed to escape, likely headed for the territorial border. Marshal Davis assured Zara that telegrams had been sent to every law enforcement office within 100 miles, but his expression suggested he shared her doubts about Jenkins facing justice. By late afternoon, the excitement had died down. The marshal and his men had departed, taking their prisoners with them and promising to maintain regular patrols near the property until Jenkins was apprehended. Deputy Collins remained behind, assigned to stay at the homestead as protection. Heath found Zara at the corral, leaning on the fence and watching her horses graze peacefully, seemingly undisturbed by the morning's violence. He joined her, resting his arms on the weathered rails. "Collins seems like a capable man," he said. "He'll keep a good watch." Zara nodded absently, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "I suppose you'll be moving on now," she said after a moment, not looking at him. "The immediate danger is past, and you've already done more than anyone could have asked." The statement caught Heath by surprise, though he realized it shouldn't have. His original intention had been to pass through Newton quickly, and nothing in his drifter's life suggested he would do otherwise once the crisis was resolved. Yet the thought of leaving, of returning to the endless wandering that had been his life for so many years, suddenly held no appeal. In the space of 2 days, Zara Sinclair had awakened something in him he'd thought long dormant, a desire for connection, for purpose beyond the next horizon. "Actually," he said carefully, I was thinking I might stay on a bit longer if you could use the help." Zara turned to look at him then, surprise and something like hope flickering across her face. "You want to stay? Why?" It was a fair question, one Heath wasn't entirely sure he could answer even to himself. "I'm between jobs anyway," he began, then stopped, recognizing the inadequacy of the explanation. He owed her more honesty than that. "The truth is, I've been drifting for a long time, Zara. Moving from one cattle drive to the next, one town to another, never staying long enough to put down roots. I told myself that was freedom, but lately I've been wondering if it's just running." "Running from what?" Zara asked softly. Heath shrugged. "Responsibility, connection. The chance of finding something worth staying for, and then losing it." He met her gaze directly. "But these past 2 days, seeing how you fight for this place, how you've made a life here despite everything, it's made me think maybe there's more courage in staying than in always moving on." Zara studied him for a long moment, as if weighing not just his words but something deeper. "I can't offer much in the way of wages," she said finally, "but there's plenty of work, and the bunkhouse is yours for as long as you want it." It wasn't quite an enthusiastic welcome, but Heath understood her caution. He was still a stranger in many ways, despite the intense circumstances that had thrown them together. Trust would take time to build. "That's more than fair," he replied with a smile. "I've worked for less." The days that followed settled into a rhythm of hard work and gradual healing. With Deputy Collins maintaining his protective watch, Heath and Zara focused on the tasks that had been neglected during the crisis, mending fences, tending livestock, and beginning repairs on the barn that had been partially destroyed in the fire. Heath found unexpected satisfaction in the physical labor, and in watching small improvements take shape under their combined efforts. Even more surprising was how easily he and Zara worked together, developing an unspoken understanding that allowed them to anticipate each other's needs and movements. 2 weeks passed with no sign of Jenkins. The marshal reduced the patrols but kept Collins assigned to the property, reasoning that Jenkins might be biding his time, waiting for vigilance to fade. The deputy had proven to be good company, respectful of both Heath and Zara while taking his protective duties seriously. One evening, as Heath was finishing repairs on a section of corral fencing, Zara approached with 2 cups of coffee. Collins was making his evening patrol of the property perimeter, giving them a rare moment alone. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering him one of the cups. "You've been at it since dawn." Heath accepted gratefully, setting aside his tools to enjoy the brief rest. "Thanks. Almost done here, though. Another day and the corral will be good as new." Zara leaned against the fence post, watching him with thoughtful eyes. "You've accomplished more in 2 weeks than I could have in a month on my own," she observed. "I'm not sure I've properly thanked you." "No thanks needed," Heath assured her. "I'm getting room and board and the satisfaction of seeing things improve." A small smile played at the corners of Zara's mouth. "Is that enough for a man who spent years chasing horizons?" The question held no judgment, just genuine curiosity. Heath considered it carefully, looking out across the peaceful property as the setting sun painted the grassland in golden hues. "You know," he said slowly, "I think it might be. There's something to be said for seeing the same sunrise from the same spot each morning, for watching your work take shape and endure." He glanced at her. "I'm beginning to understand why you fight so hard for this place." Zara's expression softened. "It gets in your blood after a while, the land, the seasons, the rhythm of it all." "It's more than that, though," Heath said. "It's what you're building here, a future that's yours by right and by effort." Their eyes met, and Heath was struck again by how easily he could lose himself in that clear green gaze. Over the past 2 weeks, He'd found himself increasingly drawn to Zara, not just her courage and determination, which had captured his admiration from the start, but her quiet humor, her intelligence, the gentle way she handled her animals. The walls she'd maintained around her heart had begun to lower, allowing him glimpses of vulnerability that made her strength all the more impressive. Whether she felt anything similar toward him, Heath couldn't say. Zara was careful with her trust, understandably so given all she'd endured. But sometimes he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, curious, considering, perhaps even hopeful. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. Both turned toward the sound, instantly alert despite the weeks of relative peace. It was Collins, returning from his patrol at a canter that suggested urgency rather than emergency. He reined in as he reached them, his expression serious but not alarmed. "Rider coming up from town," he reported. "Looks like one of the marshal's men." They walked together to meet the approaching horseman, who proved to be Deputy Wilson, one of the younger members of Marshal Davis's force. "Miss Sinclair," he called as he dismounted, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Mr. Irving, Deputy Collins. Marshal sent me with news they've caught Jenkins." The simple statement sent a wave of relief through Heath, though he noticed Zara's reaction was more reserved, her posture still tense as she waited for details. "Where?" she asked. "Dodge City," Wilson explained. He tried to join up with a cattle outfit heading back to Texas, but someone recognized him from the wanted posters. "Marshal's bringing him back to stand trial." "When?" Heath asked, knowing that the journey from Dodge would take several days. "They should be here by the end of the week," Wilson confirmed. "Marshal says to tell you the danger's past, Miss Sinclair. Jenkins won't trouble you again." Though the news should have been cause for celebration, Zara remained subdued as they thanked Wilson and sent him on his way with an invitation to return for a proper meal after his long ride. Only when the deputy had departed did she turn to Heath, her expression troubled. "He'll find a way out of it," she said quietly. "Men like Jenkins always do." "Not this time," Heath countered, understanding her skepticism but unwilling to let it diminish the significance of Jenkins's capture. Murder isn't something even his connections can easily dismiss. "And there are witnesses, not just you, but his own men who were captured. One of them is bound to talk to save his own neck." Zara's expression suggested she wasn't convinced, but she nodded, perhaps unwilling to dampen the evident relief Collins felt at the news. "I hope you're right." The days that followed brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere at the homestead. With Jenkins captured and the immediate threat removed, Collins was recalled to town, though he promised to check in regularly. His departure left Heath and Zara alone together for the first time since the night of the attack. The change was both liberating and slightly awkward, as if they were suddenly more aware of each other without the buffer of the deputy's presence. They continued their work around the property, but conversations became more personal, more revealing, as the need for constant vigilance faded. Heath learned more about Zara's childhood, her close relationship with her father and brother, and the struggles she'd faced taking over the ranch alone, not just the practical challenges but the social ones, as neighbors and townspeople questioned whether a woman could or should manage such an enterprise independently. In turn, Heath shared stories from his wandering years that he'd never told anyone, the beauty and terror of a prairie fire seen from a safe distance, the profound solitude of night watch with only the stars for company, the rare moments of transcendent connection with the natural world that had kept him moving ever westward despite the hardships. 4 days after Wilson's visit, Marshal Davis himself rode up to the homestead, bringing news that Jenkins and his captured men had been safely delivered to the county jail. The trial would begin the following week, with Zara expected to testify. "Will my testimony be enough?" she asked the marshal as they sat on the porch, Heath leaning against the railing nearby. Jenkins has friends in high places. Marshal Davis's weathered face creased in a grim smile. Not as many as he used to. Seems attempting to burn a woman alive is beyond what even his associates will countenance. And we've got one of his men willing to testify against him in exchange for leniency. The marshal's confidence was reassuring, but Heath could see Zara was still wrestling with doubt. After Davis departed, promising to send word when Zara would be needed in town for the trial, she paced the porch restlessly. "What is it?" Heath asked gently. "There's something still troubling you." Zara stopped pacing, gripping the porch railing as she stared out at her land. "Even if Jenkins goes to prison," she said slowly, "that doesn't solve the larger problem. He wanted this land to control the water, and that motivation doesn't disappear with him. Someone else will come along with the same idea." Heath moved to stand beside her. "Maybe. But they'll find you ready for them, with allies who know your worth." He hesitated, then added, "Including me if you'll have me." Zara turned to face him, her expression a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope. "You're planning to stay, even with Jenkins caught?" Heath hadn't fully acknowledged the decision to himself until that moment, but as the words left his mouth, he knew they were true. "If you're willing. There's plenty of work here for two, and I've found I enjoy building something rather than just passing through." What he couldn't say yet, was that his decision had as much to do with the woman before him as with the land she fought for. In the week since he'd pulled her from that burning barn, Heath had come to admire Zara Sinclair more than any person he'd ever known. Her courage, her determination, her capacity for joy despite all she'd endured, these qualities had awakened in him feelings he'd never expected to experience. "I'd like that," Zara said simply, her voice soft. "Having you stay." The week leading up to the trial passed in a flurry of activity. Zara insisted on continuing their work around the property, perhaps finding comfort in the familiar routines as the day of her testimony approached. Heath supported her as best he could, taking on the heaviest tasks and ensuring she had moments of rest amid the labor. The night before they were to travel into town for the trial, they sat together on the porch, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. A comfortable silence had settled between them, born of shared work and growing trust. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Heath asked finally, glancing at Zara's profile in the fading light. She considered the question before answering. "Not about testifying. The truth is simple enough. Jenkins and his men tried to murder me. It's what comes after that concerns me." "After the trial, you mean?" Zara nodded. "Assuming Jenkins is convicted, everything changes. No more looking over my shoulder, no more wondering if today is the day someone tries to take what's mine by force." She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "I've been so focused on surviving, on holding on to what my father built, that I haven't really looked beyond that. And now you can," Heath observed. "Start building your own vision, not just preserving his." "Yes." Zara's gaze held his steadily. "Which brings me back to you, Heath Irving. If you stay, what do you want from this place? From this life?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Heath had been careful in recent weeks, offering his labor and companionship without presuming more, respecting the boundaries Zara maintained even as they gradually lowered. "I want to help build something that lasts," he said honestly. "To put down roots after years of drifting. To wake up each morning knowing my work matters, that it's part of something larger than myself." He paused, then added quietly, And I want to do it alongside someone who understands what that means, who shares that vision. Zara studied him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his expression. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, for she moved closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence in the cool evening air. "When you pulled me from that barn," she said softly, "I thought I was seeing an angel through the smoke. I couldn't believe anyone would risk themselves that way for a stranger." Her hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cool against his skin. "You're not a stranger anymore, Heath." Heath turned to face her fully, his heart pounding as he carefully raised his free hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Zara," he began, uncertain what he meant to say but knowing he needed to say something. She silenced him with a gentle finger against his lips. "We both have pasts that taught us to be cautious," she said, "to protect ourselves from loss by never risking too much. But I've been thinking, isn't that just another kind of prison? Living in fear of what might happen instead of embracing what could be." Before Heath could respond, Zara leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as years of solitude and carefully maintained distance gave way to something new and precious. Heath drew her closer, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other found the small of her back, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Heath rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the first night we had dinner together," he admitted. Zara laughed softly, the sound warming him from within. "And I've been trying to convince myself it was too soon, that we barely knew each other. 6 weeks of working side by side from dawn to dusk," Heath pointed out. "I'd say we know each other better than most." "True enough." Zara's hand came up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with wonder as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. "Still, we should probably take things slowly. There's no rush." Heath nodded, understanding her caution even as his heart raced at her touch. "As slowly as you need," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." The trial of Samuel Jenkins began the following morning in the Newton courthouse, a recently constructed building that reflected the town's growing prosperity and aspirations toward civilization. Heath sat in the gallery as Zara took the stand, his pride in her evident as she recounted the horrific events clearly and without embellishment, her composure never wavering despite Jenkins's glares from the defendant's table. The prosecution presented a strong case, bolstered by the testimony of one of Jenkins's own men who had agreed to turn state's evidence. By the end of the second day, even Jenkins's expensive lawyer from Topeka looked resigned to the inevitable outcome. On the third day, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts, including attempted murder and arson. The judge, a stern-faced man with a reputation for harsh sentences, wasted no time in pronouncing judgment. 20 years in the territorial prison with no possibility of early release. As the courtroom cleared, Heath made his way to Zara, who stood talking with Marshal Davis near the prosecution table. She turned at his approach, a smile breaking across her face that chased away the last shadows of tension. "It's over," she said simply, the relief evident in her voice. Heath nodded, resisting the urge to take her in his arms there in the crowded courtroom. "He can't hurt you anymore." Marshal Davis clapped Heath on the shoulder. "You two should celebrate," he suggested. "The hotel's serving a special dinner tonight in honor of the railroad anniversary. Might be a nice change from your own cooking." The suggestion was appealing. They hadn't been to town together except for the trial, and the thought of an evening away from the property's constant demands was tempting. "What do you say?" Heath asked Zara. "Dinner in town before we head back?" Zara considered for only a moment before nodding. "I'd like that. Just let me stop by the general store first. We're running low on a few supplies." They parted ways temporarily, agreeing to meet at the hotel in an hour. Heath used the time to visit the barber shop for a proper shave and haircut, wanting to look his best for what felt like an important evening. When he arrived at the hotel, freshly groomed and wearing his cleanest shirt, Zara was waiting in the lobby. She had changed as well, trading her practical work clothes for a simple but elegant blue dress that complemented her eyes. Her dark hair was arranged in a style more sophisticated than her usual practical braid, with a few curls framing her face. The sight of her momentarily took Heath's breath away. "You look beautiful," he said sincerely as he approached. A faint blush colored Zara's cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself, Cowboy." The hotel dining room was crowded but festive, decorated with bunting and flowers for the railroad celebration. They were shown to a small table near the window, where they could watch the townspeople strolling along the main street in the early evening light. Over a meal far more elaborate than their usual fare, they talked not of Jenkins or the trial but of the future plans for expanding the cattle operation. Improvements to the house, possibilities that had seemed distant just days before, but now felt within reach. "I was thinking," Heath said as they lingered over coffee, "about that section by the creek where the soil's particularly good. It might be perfect for an orchard, apples, maybe some pears. Would take a few years to establish, but once it's bearing fruit." Zara's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "My mother always wanted fruit trees. She used to talk about the orchard her family had back east." Her expression grew thoughtful. "A few years to establish, you said," Heath nodded, understanding the question beneath her words. "I plan to be around to see it bear fruit," he assured her. "If you'll have me." Zara reached across the table to take his hand, her touch causing a now familiar warmth to spread through his chest. "I think I'd like that very much, Heath Irving." They walked back to where their horses were hitched, the evening air cool and sweet after the warmth of the dining room. The main street was busy with townspeople enjoying the celebration, music spilling from the saloon and laughter from groups gathered on various porches. As they prepared to mount up for the ride back to the homestead, Marshal Davis approached, his expression concerned. "Glad I caught you," he said, nodding to them both. "Just wanted to warn you Jenkins's lawyer was making noise after the verdict about filing an appeal. Probably nothing will come of it, but I thought you should know." Zara tensed slightly beside Heath, but her voice remained steady. "Thank you for telling us, Marshal. We'll keep an eye out." "I've arranged for regular patrols past your place for the next few weeks, just to be safe," Davis assured her. "But with Jenkins locked up tight in Topeka, I don't anticipate any trouble." They thanked the marshal and mounted their horses, setting out for the homestead as the last light faded from the western sky. Zara was quieter than she had been during dinner, clearly troubled by the marshal's news despite his reassurances. "He can file all the appeals he wants," Heath said as they rode side by side through the gathering darkness. "The evidence was solid, and the jury didn't hesitate. He's going to be behind bars for a very long time." Zara nodded, though her expression remained pensive. "I know you're right. It's just hard to believe it's really over after living with the threat for so long." "It'll take time," Heath acknowledged, "but each day that passes without trouble will make it easier to believe." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on the packed earth and the occasional call of a night bird the only interruptions to the peaceful quiet. The moon was rising, nearly full, casting everything in silver light that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. As they crested the final rise before the homestead, Zara reined in her horse, gazing down at her property spread out before them in the moonlight. "It looks different somehow," she said softly. "The same land, the same buildings, but changed." Heath understood what she meant. With the shadow of Jenkins's threat removed, the homestead seemed to shine with new possibility. No longer just a hard-won sanctuary, but the foundation for a future full of promise. "It's beautiful," he said, looking not at the land but at Zara, her profile silvered by moonlight, her expression one of wonder and renewed hope. She turned to face him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Race you to the house," she challenged suddenly, her earlier solemnity giving way to a spontaneous playfulness Heath had glimpsed only rarely in their time together. Before he could respond, she urged her horse forward, taking off down the slope at a gallop. Heath laughed and followed, giving his mare her head as they thundered toward home. Zara won by a length, pulling up in front of the house with a triumphant grin that made her look younger, freer than he'd ever seen her. They cooled and stabled their horses together, the familiar routine comforting after the excitement of town and the trial. As they walked toward the house, Zara took Heath's hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Stay with me tonight," she said quietly as they reached the porch. "Not in the bunkhouse." Heath looked down at her, searching her face in the moonlight. "Are you sure?" Zara nodded, her eyes clear and certain. "I've been alone too long, Heath. We both have. I don't want to waste any more time being cautious when life can change in an instant." She squeezed his hand gently. "I'm not afraid anymore, not of Jenkins, not of the future, not of this feeling between us." Heath raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Neither am I," he murmured against her skin. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, a shared life built on mutual respect, hard work, and a love that had been forged in fire and tempered by shared purpose. The weeks that followed brought changes to the homestead, as Heath moved his few possessions from the bunkhouse to the main house, and they began implementing some of the improvements they'd discussed, starting with repairs to the barn that had nearly become Zara's funeral pyre. As summer gave way to fall, they planted the first saplings for the orchard Heath had envisioned, working side by side to prepare the soil and carefully position each young tree. Standing back to survey their work, Zara leaned against Heath's shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her. "In 5 years this will be bearing fruit," she mused. "It's strange to think so far ahead when for so long I could only focus on getting through each day." Heath slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "I like thinking about 5 years from now," he said. 10 years. 20. All the changes we'll see, the things we'll build together." Zara turned in his embrace to face him, her expression thoughtful. "I never expected you, Heath Irving. Never thought a stranger would ride into my life and change everything." "For the better, I hope," Heath said with a smile. "Definitely for the better." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that sun and weather had etched around his eyes. "You know, I haven't thanked you properly for saving my life that day." "You don't need to thank me," Heath assured her. "Anyone would have done the same." Zara shook her head, her expression serious. "No, they wouldn't. Most people would have kept riding, minded their own business. You didn't. You risked everything for someone you didn't even know." "Best risk I ever took," Heath said softly. They were married that October. A small ceremony in the Newton church, followed by a celebration at the homestead that brought together neighbors, friends from town, and even a few of Heath's former companions from his cattle drive days who happened to be passing through. Marshall Davis served as Heath's best man, while Mrs. Peterson, who had been a friend and support to Zara since her father's death, stood as matron of honor. The weather cooperated beautifully, providing a crisp, clear day with the trees displaying their autumn colors in a glorious backdrop to the outdoor reception. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, Heath found Zara standing near the new orchard, gazing out at the land that was now truly theirs to shape together. "Happy, Mrs. Irving?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Zara turned to him with a smile that still took his breath away. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "And grateful, every day, that you happened to be riding through Newton at exactly the right moment." Heath gathered her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, as if they had been crafted for each other. "I spent 10 years wandering," he murmured against her hair, "never knowing I was looking for you all along." In the years that followed, the homestead flourished under their combined care. The orchard Heath had envisioned bore its first fruit 5 years after their marriage, just as he'd predicted. They expanded the cattle operation gradually, focusing on quality breeding stock that commanded premium prices, and established the Irving Ranch as one of the most respected in the region. Their family grew as well. Their first child, a son they named Aaron after Zara's brother, arrived a year after their wedding, a strong, healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined spirit. 2 years later came Elizabeth, named for Heath's mother, with a shock of dark hair and a smile that wrapped everyone around her tiny finger from the moment she was born. Jenkins remained in prison despite his lawyer's appeals, his influence waning with each passing year until he was little more than a distant, unpleasant memory. Newton continued to grow, the railroad bringing new settlers and opportunities, though the wildest days of the cattle boom eventually gave way to more stable, permanent development. On the 10th anniversary of the day Heath had pulled Zara from the burning barn, they stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over land that had been transformed by their vision and hard work. The house had been expanded, the herd had grown, and the orchard was in full production. But the greatest change was in themselves, two people who had found in each other the courage to stop running and start building. "You ever miss it?" Zara asked, leaning against Heath's shoulder as they watched 7-year-old Aaron teaching his little sister how to lasso a fence post. The open trail, the freedom of not being tied to one place. Heath considered the question seriously, his arm tightening around her waist. "Sometimes I miss the stars seen from a bedroll in the middle of nowhere," he admitted. "The quiet of night watch, or the camaraderie around a trail drive campfire." He turned to face her, lifting a hand to brush a strand of hair now with a few strands of silver among the dark from her face. "But I've never once regretted staying, not for a single day." Zara's smile, as warm and genuine as it had been on their wedding day, told him she understood exactly what he meant. "Neither have I," she said simply. "Not once." Their lips met in a kiss that held all the passion of their early days together, along with the deeper, steadier love that had grown through shared joys and hardships. Through the building of a life neither had dared to imagine before fate brought them together in the most desperate of circumstances. When they parted, Heath rested his forehead against hers, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting over the years. "Who would have thought," he murmured, "that the worst day of your life would lead to all of this?" "I did," Zara replied with quiet certainty. "The moment you carried me out of that barn, something inside me knew. Even through the smoke and pain, I knew my life had changed forever." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the last golden light of the setting sun. "And I was right." As their children's laughter filled the evening air and the land they had nurtured together stretched out before them, Heath and Zara Irving stood witness to the truth they had discovered together. That sometimes the greatest journeys lead not to distant horizons but home to the place where courage meets love, where roots grow deep, and where two hearts find in each other the adventure they had been seeking all along.